Do you feel distanced from God since the death of your child? Do you wish that there was someone you could talk to who understood the pain of this unique kind of loss? The Present in the Pain community is an online group of Catholic women who have experienced pregnancy and child loss. Come and find the support and understanding that you need to heal. Visit EileenTully.com and click on Community. Welcome to the Present in the Pain podcast, a weekly show that looks at the experience of pregnancy and child loss through the lens of the Catholic faith. I'm your host, Eileen Tully. This is the Present in the Pain podcast, and I'm Eileen Tully. And before we jump into this week's topic of the third sword of sorrow, I just wanted to announce the first book club meeting that we'll be having in the Present in the Pain community. It starts this Thursday, September 29th at 8 p.m. We're going to be doing it on a Zoom call, and we'll be discussing C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed. This might be a book that you already have on your shelf, but you haven't read, or maybe you read it a long time ago. It's only 4 chapters, but it's such a beautiful book about faith and grief, and he just is very real and raw about the grief he felt and how it affected his faith in God after the loss of his wife. So C.S. Lewis is just an amazing author, and it's so neat to get this glimpse of his personal reflections in this way. So I thought we would take one chapter a month and read through A Grief Observed, starting with chapter 1 tomorrow, Thursday, the 29th, and you can just RSVP for that within the community. I'll put a link in the comments below, and I would love to have you join us. We'll be live on Zoom discussing chapter 1. So today we're going to talk about Our Lady's third sword of sorrow, which was the loss of Jesus for 3 days in Jerusalem. And I mentioned last week that this is my favorite one. I find it to be my favorite because I thought it was the most relatable. So let's read a little bit about the verse that talks about this in chapter 2 of Luke, verses 46 to 50. It says, "After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, 'Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety.' He said to them, 'Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?' But they did not understand what he said to them." So, of course, this is referring to Jesus. The Holy Family was in Jerusalem and was leaving Jerusalem with a whole caravan of people. And if you remember the story, they had been traveling actually for 3 days before Mary and Joseph sort of checked in with each other and realized, wait, is Jesus? I thought he was with you. So they thought he was just among the group of travelers, and then they realized that he wasn't. So then they had to go back to Jerusalem and then search for him. So you imagine that it was 3 days of traveling, and then it took 3 days probably to get back to Jerusalem. Then they had to search for him in the city. And if you have ever lost your child in the grocery store or in an amusement park or something like that, you can imagine. Remember, I said that when I was first reading these sorrows, what I felt from Our Lady was an invitation to put myself in her place. And so as I read this one, we have a son who had disappeared one time in an amusement park. We sort of were all just walking through together, and there was one of those little trains that goes through the park that you can ride from like one end of the park to the other. And we stopped at the railroad crossing to let the train pass, and then the arm went up, and we all, along with a crowd of people from the park, walked across the train tracks and continued on to our next, ride or whatever, the next spot we were going. And all of a sudden when we were there, we realized our son was not with us. And we didn't really notice when he had gone, or remember where did he ever get here with us. We just assumed that he did because there was a big crowd of us just like this. So it was really easy for me to put myself in her place. It turned out that he had just been so interested in the train that he followed it along the tracks as it went, and we didn't notice because there were so many of us. And so we were never even really sure if he got to the next step with us or if we had lost him somewhere along the way. But, you know, as I was reading this and as I felt Our Lady invite me to put myself into her place with this, I was like, oh, of course I can imagine how terrifying that was, because it only took about 10 minutes for us to find a person who worked at the park, have them get on the walkie-talkie or whatever to ask around to the other employees if anybody's seen a little boy wandering around. And of course they had, and they found him. He was with the train, and we were reunited within 15 minutes or less, but it felt like an eternity. So it was easy for me to put myself in Our Lady's place and imagine some of the desperation that she surely must have felt when she was separated from Jesus for this much longer time. St. Alphonsus Liguori actually calls this the most painful sort of sorrow for Our Lady, which seems kind of curious because when we consider that the last swords of sorrow include his crucifixion and death, this seems rather benign in comparison. But I love this paragraph. In his book, The Glories of Mary, he has a section on the sorrows, and he reflects on each one. And his reflections are just so beautiful, his writings. And so what he says of this one is this. I'll read this quote. "A person born blind does not feel the deprivation of daylight as much as someone who becomes blind later in life. If anyone has once enjoyed the sunlight, he suffers much more keenly when deprived of it. The same applies to those unhappy souls who live blinded by the world. They have very little knowledge of God. They suffer very little from the fact that they cannot find him. But those souls who, illumined by divine light, have enjoyed the sweet presence of God through love, how bitterly they feel the loss when they find themselves deprived of his presence. Let us now see how much Mary must have suffered from this third sort of sorrow that pierced her heart when she lost Jesus in Jerusalem for 3 days, and when she was deprived of his sweet presence, which she was so accustomed to enjoy." So his point is that for all of the other sorrows or swords of sorrow, Jesus was with Mary. And in this one, it was the deprivation of him who is not just her son, but her Lord, her God, her Savior. So she is suffering much more acutely from this separation from him than would be somebody who had never spent time with Jesus. And so that separation and that desolation was just felt so much more acutely by Our Lady. But so that is why St. Alphonsus would call this the most painful sort of sorrow. In fact, he says this is one of the greatest sorrows that Mary had to endure in all her life. But for myself, when I read this, I saw that they said to Jesus, "Your Father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And I wondered, we talk about anxiety not being from God, or don't worry. The Bible talks about not worrying. But for us, when we have anxiety, we sort of have this pressure that we put on ourselves that we have to take care of something and we might not be able to do it. We know the Holy Family would not have done this, but they would have been just sort of turned to God in a prayer for asking for help. They would have had to turn to him asking for help, not frantic, but their consolation was removed from them. And so they would have had to be faithful and hopeful and turn towards God asking for help. And so when it says that they had great anxiety, I just feel like it It's a reminder that there are things that are out of our control, just as this was out of their control. But it just should make us press in more to God as they did, just hopeful and faithful and asking for Him to help them find their son. But my favorite part of this whole thing, or the thing that I found to be even more relatable than that frantic feeling of not being able to find Jesus, was that when Jesus offered his question or his explanation, why were you looking for me? Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house? That was his explanation. But I love that the verse continues by saying that they still did not understand what he was saying. So even after their faithful search and their rejoicing, of course, the joyful mysteries of the Rosary includes finding Jesus in the temple, because you can imagine that after this desolation and sorrow, the joy of being reunited with him and finding him safe and everything was fine. But when he answered their question about why he wasn't with them, it didn't answer the question for them. He answered their question with a question that they didn't know the answer to. So the thing that helped me with was those unanswered whys that we have when we are enduring our suffering. And in losing a child, I found that to be one of the hardest parts of my grief, because whether it's a miscarriage or even our stillbirth, our baby in the NICU, no matter what the situation, I felt like I, as her mother, should have been the one to protect her. I should have been the one who was able to help her. And so often we blame ourselves when there's really no one else to blame for the situation. My body failed. I must have eaten something wrong. I wasn't taking enough time for this or care of this, or I lifted something heavy. We can find all these reasons, and it is part of the grieving process to just look for something to blame. Surely we have to just have an answer as to why this happened. And because we're the mother and it was our body, it can feel easy to blame ourselves. But that's not a helpful thing. And so I love the Holy Family's example here, because there's no record of, and they wouldn't have done this because Mary didn't have sin. So there was no, I thought he was with you. Why weren't you watching him? You should have been, there was none of that. There was not a self-blame for her to say, I did this wrong. I should have done this. But rather there was just the trusting in God for the outcome of the situation. And so, although they felt anxious and were searching kind of in a hurried kind of a way, they remained faithful and hopeful. And so the lesson that we can take away from this, from the Blessed Mother, is that when we, first of all, sometimes we just have to live with those unanswered whys, right? She would come to know the answer in time and with the fruition of what was to come. But at the time, she didn't understand that was going to be happening to 12-year-old Jesus, that he would be teaching. And, she was kind of astonished to watch him doing that. So she didn't have that understanding yet that that's where he would be, or that's what he would be doing. So when we have those unanswered whys, we sort of have to just put them back in God's hands, or I like to just lay them down at the foot of the cross and say, I don't know, your ways are not my ways. This is not how I would have done things, but I trust you. I trust you with this. And so that was one of the beautiful things that she did, and that was an example for us in this third sort of sorrow. But the other one was that sometimes, especially in our grief, but sometimes in the Christian life, we find that our consolations are removed from us, and when we're praying, it feels like maybe nobody's on the other end of our prayers. Or when we go to church, it feels more like a chore than a joy. And the consolations that are offered by doing these things have been removed from us or are taken away from us. And that can be really challenging. And we can look to Our Lady as an example here because she just continued to seek. She continued to seek after Jesus until she found him. And so what I love, another reflection of St. Alphonsus Liguori's in the Glories of Mary on this sorrow says this: "This third sorrow of Mary ought to serve in the first place as a consolation to souls who are desolate and who no longer enjoy, as they once enjoyed, the sweet presence of the Lord. They may weep, but they should weep confidently, just as Mary wept over the loss of her son. They should be encouraged and not be afraid that they have lost divine grace, for St. Teresa was assured by God that no one is lost without knowing it, and no one is deceived without wishing to be deceived. If our Lord withdraws himself from the sight of a soul that loves him, he does not thereby necessarily withdraw himself from the heart. He often conceals himself from a soul, so that it may seek him with a keener desire and a more ardent love. But whoever wants to find Jesus must look for him as Mary did, not amid the pleasures and delights of the world, but amid crosses and mortifications. We sought you sorrowing, Mary said to her son. Learn then from Mary, says Origen, how to search for Jesus." So that is another way that Our Lady is just an example to us in this third sort of sorrow. I would love to discuss your thoughts about this. What do you think about this sort of sorrow? Do you find it to be relatable? Have you ever lost a child in a crowded place like I have? Have you felt that frantic feeling or that fearful feeling? Or are you left with unanswered whys and found them to be really difficult to grapple with after the loss of your child? If you come to the Present in the Pain community, there's a podcast discussion area where we can talk about this episode and all the other episodes of the podcast. Next week, we'll talk about the fourth sort of sorrow, which is meeting Jesus on the way to Calvary. And before I sign off, I just want to let you know about a few upcoming in-person retreats that I have for grieving mothers. October is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month, and October 15th in particular is Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Day. And on that day, I'll be holding a grieving mothers retreat in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You'll be able to find information about that on my website, and I'll post a link below. And on October 29th, I'll be hosting a grieving mothers retreat in Jaffrey, New Hampshire at St. Patrick's Church. So you're welcome to find both of those on my website. I'll put a link below for that. And I would love to see you there and meet you at one of the retreats in person. I also, of course, have the online retreat that you can start whenever and wherever you are from the comfort of your home. It's full of videos that go in depth into not just the 7 sorrows of Mary, but so much more, with lots of healing tools for grieving and healing from the loss of a child. So until next week, I'm Eileen Tully, and I'm so thankful you're here.